Was Frank Lloyd Wright actually a bad architect? Of all the names that hover over American architecture, none looms larger than Frank Lloyd Wright. Architecture students are taught that he's the greatest architect this country has ever produced, myself included, and that his work represents the pinnacle of design thinking in the 20th century. Fallingwater alone has been called the most important American building ever constructed, but it is frankly one of the most successful pieces of architectural marketing history. Simply put, influence is not the same as competence, and reverence is not the same as merit. The Wright we have been sold, the self-taught American genius who single-handedly invented modern architecture, bears about the same relationship to the truth as a stage magician bears to actual sorcery. There is a trick to it, and the trick is worth examining. Hi everyone, Ken here. Hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into a special episode of This House. Frank Lincoln Wright was born in Ridgeland Center, Wisconsin in 1867. He would later change his middle name to Lloyd, after his mother's family, and in his autobiography, he would claim that his mother had decided before his birth that he would become a great architect, going so far as to hang engravings of European cathedrals over his crib. There is no contemporary evidence that this ever happened, but it is a useful illustration of how Wright told the story of his own life. The myth came first, and the facts were arranged around it. Wright never earned an architecture degree. He never earned any degree at all. He attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison for 2 semesters as a special student in civil engineering, took some drawing classes, and left in 1887 without graduating. He moved to Chicago and found drafting work in the office of Joseph Lyman Silsby, who was producing competent, if unremarkable, shingle-style houses. Within a year, Wright had moved on to the firm of Adler & Sullivan, where he would later admit he received the only real architectural education of his life. Louis Sullivan was, by every meaningful measure, the actual genius of late 19th century American architecture. The phrase form follows function is his. The articulation of the steel-frame skyscraper as a new kind of building requiring its own honest expression is his. The intricate organic ornamentation that Wright would spend the rest of his career imitating is his. While employed by Adler & Sullivan, Wright took on private residential commissions on the side in direct violation to his contract. When Sullivan discovered the arrangement in 1893, he fired Wright, and the two men did not speak for more than a decade. This is the man who would later be marketed as the lone American original. He was fired from his only real job for stealing from his employer. Now let's be clear, architecture is not sculpture. A building must perform for its inhabitants. It must keep water out and heat in, support its own weight under load, and remain standing across decades of use. By these basic measures, the measures any architect is professionally bound to meet, Wright's record is, to put it gently, alarming. Take Fallingwater, the 1935 weekend house Wright designed for Pittsburgh department store heir Edgar J. Kaufman Sr., perched on a waterfall in rural Pennsylvania. It is the building most often cited as evidence of Wright's genius, and it is also the building that most clearly illustrates the gap between his ambition and his competence. Wright designed dramatically cantilevered concrete terraces extending out over the stream, and he specified the reinforcing steel himself. His engineers told him he had not used enough. Kaufman, who was paying for the house and trusting his own consulting engineers more than he trusted Wright, quietly instructed the contractor to add additional steel to the cantilevers. Wright found out, was furious, and accused Kaufman of betraying the design. Decades later, when restoration teams began assessing Fallingwater in the 1990s, they discovered that even with the extra reinforcement, the cantilevers had been steadily sagging since the day they were poured. The building was on its way to collapse. A multi-million-dollar restoration, completed in 2002, installed post-tension steel cables to stop the sag. Without that intervention, the most famous house in America would have eventually fallen into the waterfall it was designed to celebrate. Then there's the S.C. Johnson Administration Building in Racine, Wisconsin, completed in 1939, the one with the famous mushroom-shaped concrete columns that tapered down to delicate points on the floor. Wright was warned by the structural engineers that the columns, as he had drawn them, could not possibly support the roof. To get a building permit, Wright was forced to perform a public load test in front of state inspectors. The columns held, which Wright treated as a personal vindication. What is rarely mentioned is that the building is leaked from the day it opened. Thousands of glass tubes from the clerestory and skylights, and they have never been watertight. But what about his overseas work? The Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, completed in 1923, is the source of one of Wright's most cherished myths. The story, which Wright told and retold for the rest of his life, is that his hotel was the only large building in Tokyo to survive the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, and that he had engineered it on a floating cantilever foundation specifically to ride out seismic events. The reality, established by historians and engineers studying contemporaneous accounts, is more embarrassing. The hotel did not collapse, but it sustained significant damage. The floating foundation caused parts of the building to settle unevenly, and the structure was plagued by sinking issues for the rest of its existence. The famous celebratory telegram, supposedly sent by the hotel manager declaring the building intact, was sent in the immediate aftermath, before the post-quake distress reached the district and was later partially walked back. The hotel was demolished in 1968 not because it had outlived its usefulness, but because it had become structurally unsound and was sinking visibly into Tokyo's soft soil, ripping itself apart. Only the entrance lobby was saved, and that was relocated to an open-air museum on solid footing. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York, completed in 1959 after Wright's death, is perhaps the most famous example of a Wright building actively fighting its intended use. 21 artists, including Willem de Kooning and Robert Motherwell, signed a letter of protest in 1956 stating that the proposed museum's curving, sloping ramps would make it impossible to display paintings properly. They were correct. Paintings hung on the inward-leaning walls, appearing to tilt forward. The continuous spiral makes it impossible to step back from a work without bumping into the railing or another viewer while standing lopsided. The skylight has leaked since the building opened. Curators have spent more than half a century quietly compensating for design choices that prioritize Wright's sculptural vision over the museum's basic function. This is not a list of unfortunate accidents, it is a pattern. Architecture, properly practiced, is a service profession. The architect serves the client. Wright reversed this relationship as a matter of philosophy. His clients did not so much commission buildings from him as they were granted the privilege of paying for one. And once the commission was accepted, they were expected to live as Wright instructed. Lauren Pope, a copy editor at the Washington Evening Star with a modest budget, wrote Wright in 1939 begging for a Usonian home. Wright agreed, and what Pope received was a beautiful and almost unlivable home. The ceilings were too low for guests of average height. Wright stood about 5 foot 8 inches and saw no reason anyone else should require more headroom. The kitchen was a galley so narrow that 2 people could not pass. Storage was minimal because Wright disapproved of possessions. Pope and his wife loved the house. They were true believers, but even they admitted it functioned poorly as a place to actually live. Paul and Jean Hanna, Stanford professors who commissioned a house from Wright in 1937, found themselves the owner of a hexagonal honeycomb plan that Wright insisted upon despite the site's incompatibility with such a layout. The house required custom fabricated furniture because no standard pieces would fit a 60 or 120-degree angle. Frederick C. Roby commissioned the Roby House in Chicago in 1908 and lived in it for 14 months before being forced to sell due to financial reversals and the breakdown of his marriage, a breakdown his daughter later attributed in part to the relentless impracticality of the house. The next owner sold within a year. The house cycled through hands until it nearly faced demolition in 1957, saved only by Wright himself, emerging to call it a great work of art, conveniently ignoring the fact that no family had been able to actually live in it. Edgar Kaufman Sr., the Fallingwater client, eventually moved out of the house because the constant sound of rushing water, which Wright had positioned the structure to maximize, led to mold, caused him debilitating headaches, and made the house impossible to sleep in. He retreated to a more conventional dwelling on the property and used Fallingwater primarily for entertaining. The pattern is consistent. Wright designed for the photograph, not the inhabitant. Built-in furniture meant clients could not rearrange rooms. Tiny bedrooms meant they could not entertain houseguests. Carports meant their cars rusted in the rain. Flat roofs in snow country meant they leaked in winter. When clients complained, Wright's standard response was that they did not understand his work. Many wept, many sued. Most simply overspent on the architectural failures and had to learn to live around the architect's preferences in their own homes. But these failures aren't the only problem with Wright's reputation. For an architect who marketed himself as a singular American original, Wright had a remarkable habit of taking other people's ideas and presenting them as his own. The roots of his prairie style, the long horizontal lines, the deep eaves, the central hearth, the cruciform plan, are traceable directly to his work in Sullivan's office and the shingle-style houses he had drafted under Silsby. The open plan he claimed to have invented was being explored simultaneously by half a dozen of his contemporaries, especially in Oak Park, Illinois, where he lived. Other architects were branching off the arts and crafts style, simplifying the lines, and doing away with ornamentation. Some of these houses you would swear were Wright's prairie style, but alas, he took credit for the architectural evolution unfolding around him. The initial integration of building and landscape was the explicit thesis of the arts and crafts movement, which preceded Wright's career by decades. Most unfortunately, Wright lifted from his betters with little apparent compunction. The semicircular Romanesque archway of the V.C. Morris gift shop in San Francisco, which Wright designed in 1948 and which is now treated as one of his late masterworks, is a near-direct quotation of the entry arch on H. Richardson's Glesner House in Chicago, completed in 1887. Even Wright's engagement with Japanese architecture is similar. He traveled to Japan repeatedly and amassed an enormous collection of Japanese woodblock prints, at one point earning more from print dealing than from architecture. The horizontal emphasis, the modular planning grid, the deep overhanging eaves, and the dissolution of interior and exterior spaces that became hallmarks of Wright's domestic works were all features of traditional Japanese residential architecture. Wright credited his appreciation of Japanese prints in his autobiography, but minimized their architectural influence on his own designs, often suggesting that any resemblance was coincidental and arose from shared underlying principles. The historical record, including his own travel itineraries and the dates of his stylistic shifts, suggest otherwise. There is no shame in being influenced. Every architect is influenced. Creatives are constantly standing on the shoulders of those who came before them, reaching further and further. The shame is in pretending he was not, in fact, doing the same. Wright's professional life was a near continuous procession of financial disasters and personal upheavals, many of which he caused and few of which he managed gracefully. He was perpetually in debt, he routinely failed to pay subcontractors and suppliers, and was sued repeatedly. In 1909, at the height of his prairie-style success, Wright abandoned his wife Catherine and their 6 children to travel through Europe with Mama Cheney, the wife of a former client. The scandal effectively ended his Oak Park practice and made him professionally radioactive in Chicago for years. Catherine refused to grant him a divorce for more than a decade. Then, the 1914 tragedy at Taliesin, his Wisconsin home and studio, is among the darkest events in American architectural history. While Wright was away in Chicago overseeing a project, a domestic worker named Julian Carlton locked the doors of the dining wing, set the building on fire, and attacked the residents with a hatchet as they tried to flee. 7 people lost their lives, including Mama Borthwick and her 2 children. The motive was never definitively established, and Carlton died in custody. Wright rebuilt Taliesin and continued. He would rebuild it again after a second fire in 1925. To stabilize his income and his labor force, Wright established the Taliesin Fellowship in 1932, a residential apprenticeship program that he described as a school of architecture and that critics, then and since, have described as something closer to a cult with an unpaid construction crew. Apprentices paid tuition for the privilege of working on Wright's commissions, building his houses, cooking his meals, and tending his fields. They received no formal architectural education in any conventional sense. Many spent years in the fellowship without ever progressing past manual labor. Wright's third wife, who had been a spiritualist, exerted considerable spiritual control over the apprentices, and her influence on the fellowship deepened after Wright's death in 1959 and persisted until her own death in 1985. The historical Wright is, in many places, indistinguishable from the autobiographical Wright, and the autobiographical Wright was a carefully designed structure without any flaws or failures, unlike the reality of his buildings. So why is Frank Lloyd Wright revered? Part of the answer is that he was, in fact, genuinely influential, and that influence deserves clear-eyed acknowledgement. Wright understood earlier, and more vividly than most of his American contemporaries, that the Victorian house was over. The dark, compartmentalized, ornament-encrusted American home of the 1880s was incompatible with the way 20th century families would actually live. His prairie houses, for all their leaks and low ceilings and impractical built-ins, articulated a new spatial logic. Open plans, horizontal lines, integration with the site, the primacy of the hearth. That became the operating grammar of mid-century American residential architecture and remains the operating grammar of new construction today. The open-plan kitchen dining living space in nearly every new American house is a Wright inheritance. Part of the answer is that Wright was a brilliant self-promoter. He wrote constantly, he gave interviews, he cultivated relationships with photographers and editors. He shaped the narrative of his own career with the same care he should have devoted to his structures, and the narratives outlived him. And part of the answer is that the buildings and photographs are often genuinely beautiful. Fallingwater, sagging cantilevers and all, is a gorgeous image. The Guggenheim spiral, however poorly it functions as a museum, is an unforgettable form. Wright understood the photograph as a medium of architectural persuasion before most of his peers did, and his work was tailored, consciously or not, to reproduce well in print. But influence and beauty, however real, are not the same as competence. An architect's first obligation is to produce buildings that work, that shelter, that endure, that serve the people who paid for them. Wright failed this obligation with remarkable consistency, and the profession's willingness to overlook that failure has had consequences that reach all the way to the present. So was Frank Lloyd Wright actually a good architect? He was a great image maker. He was a brilliant manipulator of horizontal line and interior space. He was, in the final analysis, an extraordinarily influential figure whose ideas we are still living with, for better or for worse. But a good architect, one whose buildings serve their clients, stand up to weather, and remain useful across generations, is a more demanding title. By that standard, the answer is uncomfortable. The buildings sag, the roofs leak, the clients suffered. The credit was borrowed, and the man we have been told to revere as the greatest architect America ever produced was in fact something more like the most successful one. That is its own kind of achievement. It is just not the achievement we have been sold. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. What are your thoughts on Frank Lloyd Wright? Let me know down below in the comments section, and while you're there, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an exciting episode of This House.